After the brutal murder of Emmett Till, the civil rights movement began gaining momentum, and one of its key battlegrounds became education. In a true democracy, education should be the great equalizer, the foundation for opportunity and progress. But in the United States, education became another weapon of oppression. It started long before the 1950s. In 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the doctrine of separate but equal, making racial segregation legal across schools, transportation, and nearly all public life. In reality, nothing was equal. Take Mississippi in 1930. The state spent $37 per white student and only $7 per black student. That number tells a story. White children had access to new textbooks, better trained teachers, heated classrooms, and extracurricular programs. Black children were often taught in crumbling buildings with hand me down books, broken desks, and no heat. This wasn't accidental neglect, it was deliberate design. The system was structured to ensure black children would remain uneducated, underpaid, and powerless. Then, in 1954, the Supreme Court finally overturned Plessy with Brown versus Board of Education, declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. That decision changed the law, but it didn't change the mindset of white America. In fact, the resistance was vicious. Southern states delayed, defied, and outright ignored the ruling. In 1957, when the Little Rock Nine attempted to attend a white high school in Arkansas, they were met by angry mobs and had to be escorted by federal troops. Even in the North, segregation didn't disappear. It just wore a new mask. School zoning, housing segregation, redlining, and so called school choice that funneled resources into white suburban schools while starving black and brown communities. And the legacy is still with us. Today, majority black schools receive, on average, thousands of dollars less per student than majority white schools. They have fewer honors programs, fewer mental health resources, and more police in hallways than counselors. This is how inequality works in a democracy, not by denying rights on paper, but by denying resources in practice. If education is power, then what we see here is the systemic theft of black potential, not just then, but still today. In a true democracy, voting should be sacred, a right that's protected, encouraged, and accessible to all. But in America, the right to vote has been treated like an exclusive club, with gatekeepers and bouncers at every door. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment promised black men the right to vote, but almost immediately, white lawmakers began constructing barriers to make sure that promise stayed on paper. In the South, black voters were forced to take literacy tests. These weren't simple reading exercises, they were rigged. In some cases, people had to recite the entire U.S. Constitution word for word, or answer trick questions with no correct answer. And if they somehow passed, they were hit with a poll tax, a fee just to vote. If that didn't work, states used grandfather clauses, rules that said you could vote if your grandfather had. But how could a black man's grandfather have voted if he was enslaved? Even more blatant were white only primaries, actual elections that legally excluded black voters. These existed until 1944, upheld by the courts for decades. And even if you were registered and passed all the tests, there was still a price. Lynchings, beatings, job loss, threats to your family, all for daring to cast a ballot. Fast forward to today, and the tactics have changed, but the goal hasn't. We hear about voter ID laws, and while they may sound fair, studies have shown they disproportionately impact black, Latino, and low income voters, especially those who move often, work long hours, or lack access to the specific kinds of IDs required. Polling places in black neighborhoods have been closed, forcing people to travel farther, wait longer, or simply give up. Early voting has been restricted. Voter rolls are purged without warning, and it all exploded after 2013, when the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County versus Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act. That decision removed federal oversight of states with a history of racial discrimination in voting laws. Within 24 hours, states passed new restrictive voting laws, and the war on the black vote was back in full swing. So, yes, today there are no literacy tests or grandfather clauses, but there are new methods, new excuses, and the same goal: to silence black voices at the ballot box and maintain control over a system that was never built for equality. In America, voting is not a right, it's a fight. And for many black communities, that fight is generational. Policing in America was not born to serve and protect, it was born to control. The first organized police forces in the US weren't patrolling neighborhoods or responding to emergencies. They were called slave patrols, formed in the 1700s and 1800s. Their job was simple: track, capture, beat, and terrorize enslaved black people. They could break into homes without cause, inflict violence at will, and act outside the law because they were the law. After the Civil War, that system didn't end. It just changed names. Black codes criminalized existence. You could be arrested for loitering, not having a job, or violating a made up curfew. These vague charges were used to funnel black men into convict leasing, another name for slavery. Fast forward to today, and the pattern is still alive. Instead of slave patrols, we have racial profiling. Instead of black codes, we have stop and frisk and driving while black. These modern tactics carry the same old message: you are a suspect simply for being black. And the numbers tell the truth. Black Americans are 2.9 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans. One in every 1,000 black men in America will die at the hands of law enforcement. And in nearly 99% of police killings, no officer is ever charged. That's not a broken system. That's a system functioning as designed. Policing in America has never been neutral. It was built as a tool of racial dominance, and even now, it operates with that same bias baked into its foundations. When we talk about racial inequality shaping democracy, this is what we mean. How free can a person be when the state sees their existence as a threat? How equal is a democracy that treats skin color as probable cause? Until we confront the roots of policing in this country, the truth, not the myth, we can't begin to reshape justice. Because what we have now is not safety for all, it's surveillance and punishment for some. When we think about racial inequality, we often picture slavery, segregation, or police violence. But one of the most damaging and long lasting tools of racial injustice happened quietly, on paper, with a pen. This wasn't just about discrimination in schools or voting booths, it was about something more foundational: where people could live and whether they could build wealth. In the 1930s, the US government partnered with banks and created Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. They drew up color coded maps to decide which neighborhoods were safe for investment. Black neighborhoods were outlined in red and labeled hazardous. This is where the term redlining comes from. It didn't matter if residents had good jobs or perfect credit. If you were black or an immigrant, your community was marked as risky. And what did that mean? It meant no mortgages, no home improvement loans, no insurance. Your house wouldn't rise in value. You couldn't build equity. You couldn't leave something behind for your children. Meanwhile, white families, often living just blocks away, were offered low interest home loans, government subsidized mortgages, and access to the GI Bill after World War II. Here's the kicker: Black veterans were routinely denied those benefits. They served, they sacrificed, but when they came home, they were told, "You're not welcome in the suburbs. You can't live next to white families. You don't get the dream you fought for." The result: a massive engineered racial wealth gap. White families bought homes, passed them down, and accumulated wealth. Black families were boxed into communities with lower property values, underfunded schools, and zero upward mobility. This wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Black families were told by the system, "You don't belong, you don't deserve opportunity." Even today, neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s still suffer from disinvestment, environmental hazards, higher poverty, and lower life expectancy. These scars are generational. So when people ask why the average white family has 8 to 10 times the wealth of the average black family, it's not because of lack of effort. It's because the government itself wrote inequality into the law. Redlining shows us something critical. Racism isn't just about hate, it's about design. It was built into our housing policies, our mortgage systems, and our map of the American dream, and the damage is still with us. By the middle of the 20th century, the cracks in American democracy were no longer just visible, they were gaping wounds. The Constitution claimed that all men are created equal, that liberty and justice were promised to all. But for black Americans, those promises were lies dressed up in ink. They were denied the right to vote, denied access to decent housing, denied equal education, fair jobs, and basic dignity. The gap between what America said it was and what it actually was had become unbearable. So people took to the streets. And what they did next wasn't just protest, it was a moral uprising. In Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks said no to giving up her seat on a segregated bus. But that moment wasn't random, it was planned, and it ignited a fire. A 381-day boycott followed, led by a then unknown preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Black residents walked miles to work every day rather than fund a system that humiliated them, and they won. In Greensboro, North Carolina, four black college students sat at a whites only lunch counter at Woolworth's and refused to leave. They were threatened, mocked, and assaulted, but they came back the next day and the next, and their courage sparked a national sit in movement. Then came the Freedom Riders, black and white activists who rode Greyhound buses into the Deep South to challenge segregated terminals. They were dragged off buses, beaten with pipes and bats, firebombed, and jailed. But they kept going. Their buses were set on fire in Alabama. Mobs beat them unconscious in Mississippi. And still, they returned to ride again. That is the definition of bravery. In Birmingham, the brutality reached a new low. Peaceful child marchers, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, were met with German shepherds, fire hoses strong enough to tear bark off trees, and mass arrests. Over 1,000 children were jailed in 1 week. And while this was happening, the media was there. The nation saw it. The world saw it. And America's mask began to crack. Then came August 28, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people stood together in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, not just for a dream, but for demands. End segregation, protect voting rights, guarantee jobs, dismantle housing discrimination, pass real legislation. That day, Dr. King's words echoed across the world. But the real message was this: we are tired of waiting. Your Constitution says we are equal, now prove it. And change began to happen, but not without blood. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation and employment discrimination. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act attacked the literacy tests, poll taxes, and voter intimidation that had silenced black voices for generations. But those wins came at an unbearable price. Medgar Evers, a father and activist, was shot in the back in his own driveway. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were murdered in a church bombing in Birmingham, planted by white supremacists. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, three civil rights workers, were kidnapped, shot, and buried in an earthen dam by Klan with the help of local police. This wasn't just a protest. This was a confrontation with the soul of America. And it was black Americans who forced that confrontation. They held up the Constitution like a mirror and asked, is this who we are? Or who we pretend to be? And when the system tried to ignore them, they marched louder. When it tried to crush them, they stood taller. They didn't ask for justice. They demanded it. And they made it impossible for the nation to look away. By now, we've seen how racial inequality in America has taken many forms: chains, Jim Crow, redlining, voter suppression, police brutality. But perhaps the most chilling evolution of all has been what replaced slavery after it was abolished. Because slavery never truly ended, it just changed shape. It put on a new uniform, built new walls, and renamed itself the criminal justice system. Let's go back to the 13th Amendment, the one that supposedly ended slavery. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except as punishment for a crime. That one clause, except as a punishment for a crime, is the loophole that reopened the door to slavery, and we've been walking through it ever since. After the Civil War, Southern states used this loophole to arrest thousands of black men for things like vagrancy, loitering, or talking back, then leased them out as convict labor to plantations, railroads, and coal mines. These weren't criminals, they were targets. It was slavery by another name. Fast forward to today, and we still see that same system of control, now called mass incarceration. The United States has roughly 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of the world's prison population. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. 1 in 3 black men in America can expect to be incarcerated in their lifetime. Prisons are often built in rural white communities while pulling inmates from urban black neighborhoods. Let's be clear, this is not about justice. This is about profit. The modern prison system generates billions of dollars in labor, surveillance contracts, food services, and phone call fees. Private prison corporations lobby lawmakers to pass harsher sentences and expand detention. Inmates, many of them black, are paid as little as 13 cents an hour to do jobs like sewing uniforms, packaging Starbucks cups, or fighting wildfires in California. This is not rehabilitation. That's modern-day slavery. And like before, the laws are written to protect the system, not the people caught in it. The war on drugs devastated black communities in the 80s and 90s, cracking down hard on crack cocaine while ignoring powder cocaine in white suburbs. Mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, and broken windows policing all targeted communities of color and filled prisons by design. Even today, minor offenses like unpaid tickets or marijuana possession can destroy a person's future if they're poor and black. So no, the chains didn't disappear. They became cells. The plantation became the prison, and freedom became conditional, based on your zip code, your income, and your skin. This is the legacy of a system that never stopped trying to own black bodies. It simply changed the form, from shackles to cages. And the most haunting part, it was all done legally. We often treat civil rights like something that happened a long time ago. Marches, speeches, black and white photos. But black lives are still being taken by a system that was never built to protect them. Let's start with Trayvon Martin. He was just 17 years old. He had no weapon, just a hoodie, a bag of Skittles, and a phone in his hand. He was walking home in Sanford, Florida in 2012 when he was followed and shot by George Zimmerman, a man who claimed self-defense and was never convicted. Trayvon was criminalized in death. His hoodie became a symbol, his face became a warning, and his name became a hashtag. Then came Sandra Bland in 2015. She was pulled over in Texas for a minor traffic violation, failing to signal a lane change. But when she questioned the officer's aggression, she was arrested and jailed. 3 days later, she was found dead in her cell. Authorities called it suicide, but her family and the public demanded answers. How does a traffic stop end in death? The silence was deafening. And then George Floyd. In 2020, the world watched as a police officer knelt on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George begged for his life. He said, "I can't breathe." He called out for his mother. And millions of us saw that moment, not just as one man's death, but as the breaking point of centuries of racial violence. People poured into the streets, not just in Minneapolis, but in all 50 states and across the globe. This was the largest civil rights movement in modern history. But let's be honest, this wasn't new. George Floyd's murder didn't reveal something hidden. It confirmed what black communities had always known. The system isn't broken. It's operating exactly as it was designed. These deaths, Trayvon, Sandra, George, and so many others, are not isolated incidents. They are part of an unbroken chain that runs through plantations, lynchings, police brutality, and mass incarceration. And despite all the protests, the statistics remain horrifying. Police in America still kill around 3 people a day. Black Americans are still more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and killed by police than any other group. And in most of those killings, no one is held accountable. Black Lives Matter began in 2013 after Trayvon Martin's death, but it became global rallying cry after Floyd. A demand not just for justice, but for the right to live, the right to breathe, the right to exist without fear. And yet, laws have been passed in response to the protests, not to protect lives, but to criminalize dissent. In some states, it's now harder to protest than it is to purchase a firearm. So let's be clear. The civil rights movement never ended. It continues in courtrooms, classrooms, voting booths, and in the streets. Because until black lives are safe, valued, and free, American democracy will remain incomplete. And that's why this presentation doesn't end here. It carries forward, because the fight does too. While we've talked about historical systems like slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining, it's important to understand that the failure didn't end in the past. It continues today in foundational systems that are supposed to serve and protect everyone. Let's start with education. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional, schools remain deeply unequal. In many parts of the country, black children attend schools that are underfunded, overcrowded, and lack up to date textbooks or functioning facilities. This isn't just coincidence. It's the legacy of redlining and property tax based school funding. Neighborhoods that were once legally segregated and economically starved are now home to the lowest performing schools, not because of the people who live there, but because of the policies that trap them there. Then we move to healthcare. The COVID 19 pandemic pulled back the curtain on a truth that's long been obvious to black communities. Black Americans have worse health outcomes because they have less access, less trust, and less protection. During the pandemic, black people were more likely to contract COVID, more likely to be hospitalized, and more likely to die from it. Not because of biology, but because of structural inequality. Decades of environmental racism, limited access to healthy food, fewer nearby hospitals, and bias in medical treatment have all created a system where black pain is minimized and black lives are deprioritized. For example, studies show that black patients are less likely to receive pain medication for the same condition as white patients. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy related complications than white women, even when income and education are equal. Whether we're talking about schools, hospitals, housing, or public safety, the pattern is clear. Systems in America were not designed with black people in mind, and in many cases, they were designed to exclude them outright. So, when we ask how racial inequality continues to shape democracy, this is part of the answer. Because if education, healthcare, housing, and safety aren't guaranteed equally, then neither is freedom. And until these systems are rebuilt with justice at their core, black Americans will continue to live in a country where democracy promises what it doesn't deliver. Let's step into the courtroom, not as jurors, but as historians. Because the Supreme Court, the very institution designed to defend the Constitution, has not just failed black Americans, it has helped engineer their oppression. Let's examine the record. Exhibit A, Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. A black man sued for his freedom. The court responded with this: no person of African descent can be a citizen of the United States. Not only was Dred Scott denied his freedom, the court erased the citizenship of all black people, free or enslaved. This wasn't law, it was racial doctrine passed down as law. Exhibit B, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The court ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. That decision created the legal foundation for Jim Crow segregation for nearly 60 years. It told the country that black schools, black water fountains, black train cars were good enough. It told white America it was okay to build democracy on separate tracks. Exhibit C, Korematsu versus United States, 1944. Yes, this case was about Japanese Americans, but it proved a chilling principle. If you're not white, your rights can be suspended for national convenience. The court upheld internment camps, mass surveillance, racial profiling. Sound familiar? Exhibit D, Shelby County versus Holder, 2013. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had worked. Too well, apparently. So the court struck down its core protection, and in less than 24 hours, states rushed to pass new voting restrictions targeting black and brown voters. They didn't even wait. What does this tell us? It tells us that the Supreme Court isn't above politics, that the Constitution, unless pushed, challenged, and reinterpreted by the people, can be used to uphold injustice, not correct it. The bench has never been neutral. Its history is not just a record of progress, it's a ledger of decisions that codified racism, protected segregation, and gave legal cover to injustice. So when we speak about racial inequality shaping democracy, we must include the court. Because sometimes the greatest threat to freedom comes not from lawlessness, but from the law itself.